Hi everyone, it's so good to have you back here. I hope you had a chance to grab some lunch, or if you're in a time zone that doesn't work so well for here, maybe have a nap. Next up, we have William Brown from SUS, and he's talking about a project that has the cutest crab holding a passport as an icon that I've ever seen. Thanks so much for being here, William.
Great. Thank you very much for having me and giving me that introduction. And thanks everyone for coming along to watch. I'm here to talk to you today about my life amongst the Authentications. So who am I? My name is William Brown. I'm a senior software engineer at SUSE Labs. My online nickname, as you'll more often see me, is First Year. I'm a member of the 389 directory server team, which is one of the major open source LDAP servers and identity products. I'm based in Brisbane, which is in Queensland, Australia, which means that the time zone I'm in is UTC plus 10. So the best way to get in contact with me if you have any questions at all is email, and my email is wbrown@suse.de. So how I got involved in the 389 directory server project is actually a little bit of a story, and a lot of people think that identity management developers are a bit of an endangered species. Many people think that IDM is this, solved problem that, we've already found all the solutions, just get your identity as a service and move on. But I don't really think that's the case. And really, my passion for identity management really started when I was a student at the University of Adelaide, as pictured here at the computer science department when I was a student there. And I was never really allowed to learn a lot about programming or computers until I was at the age of 17, when I was kicked out of home by my delightful family, as I'll call them. With my newfound freedom, I really wanted to learn a lot more about IT, and what really fascinated me when I became involved with the computer science group was, how do these computer science lab machines work? They were all running Linux desktops, and they just could magically find your home directory, and you could log into all of them and do all this stuff. And I was so fascinated by that. So actually, I started a project, and I tried to recreate the university's lab machines at home. And so I learned a lot about NFS and auto mount, desktops, networking, how to do PXE boot installs. But the only thing I could never really figure out was how the machines log in. So one day I saw the technician who was actually responsible for installing the machines in the lab. And I approached him, and I explained what my project was. And he helpfully sat me down, and he explained PAM and LDAP to me. LDAP is a binary protocol, very similar to something like SQL or HTTP, that allows accessing a directory database. It's similar to a phone directory, and it contains users and groups. It also has the ability to check for passwords in accounts. The data isn't structured as a table like in something like SQL, but much closer to JSON, where you have objects containing key value pairs. The content of what key value pairs can exist is defined by a schema. In addition, these objects or entries can be structured into a tree, allowing hierarchical organization and searching capability. LDAP was created in 1997 as a successor to the Directory Access Protocol, part of the X500 standards. X500 was a series of standards created by the International Telecom Union, and it covers a whole bunch of different topics like X509 certificates. And this is why LDAP DNs look so similar to LDAP DNs look so similar to certificate DNs. They were designed to be interchangeable. X509 was actually intended to be the authentication mechanism for which you would use to update an X500 directory. But then when web browsers came along and became much more popular, there needed to be a simple method of exchanging certificates between machines. And this is where X509 really broke out and into its own, especially with CA stores as we know them today. Since then, LDAP has become the lingua franca of identity, where almost all software in some shape or form has the ability to access LDAP as an authentication and identity source. The other major authentication protocol of similar age, which was invented in the 1980s, its current incantation v5 was invented in 1993, is Kerberos. SSL and TLS weren't created until 1995. And back in the 90s and early 2000s, cryptographic operations were still expensive on CPUs, so people resisted using TLS on all connections unless it was really needed. And so this led to Kerberos being developed as a way to authenticate over a network where any person could be intercepting and reading your traffic. So Kerberos allows you to authenticate without ever actually sending your password over the network using a set of cryptographic operations. It was also then later made possible for Kerberos to install network encryption layers, very similar to what happens today with TLS. And this means that Kerberos can act as a root of trust for your enterprise. And like all of these technologies have really developed over time, and they all have very different implementations and uses. And I eventually, my passion in identity management eventually led me to become part of the system administration team at the University of Adelaide. And I got to see these really in action. Pictured here was the production Sun directory server, which was what we were using at the time. And I was involved in the project to migrate, at the very tail end of it, to migrate from the Sun directory servers to the Red Hat directory servers, which we then started to use. The other major authentication system we had at the university was Windows or Microsoft Active Directory, which is a combination of LDAP and Kerberos. Our Unix LDAP servers through the Red Hat directory servers, they provide identity to our websites, our Macs, our Linux infrastructure. And these are the websites that every student is logging into for all of their coursework all the time. So they're very, very busy systems. And Active Directory authenticated our thousands of workstations that run campus and our Wi-Fi with Radius. And again, universities are very busy when it comes to wireless infrastructure. We generally had about 20,000 or more devices on the Wi-Fi at any point in time. And to me, it was so interesting to see how important these technologies were. These systems were processing thousands of operations per second, and they were so critical to the university's ability to function. And that if Active Directory or LDAP ever stopped working, the whole university would essentially stop. They're so fundamental and important. And this was really reflected in how they're configured to be highly available. And even in disaster recovery plans, after the core network, LDAP and Active Directory were the next services to be restored because everything else depends on them. But because we were using Red Hat Directory Server and the upstream project for that being the open source 389 directory server, I was able to contribute to the project because it's open source. So my very first contribution, as pictured here in February of 2015, was to add some extra ability to do some uniqueness constraints in one of the plugins. And one of the developers, Noriko, she was super lovely, and she helped me out so much to get this code actually in a mergeable state over the course of a couple of months. And after that experience of being helped so much by her, I decided to continue to contribute. And I had started to develop a bunch of Python administration tools for 389 as part of my work at the University of Adelaide. And so I began to contribute some of these things when I found the time. It was then when I met Fraser Twiddale at PyCon AU in 2015, and we talked about some of this work. He encouraged me that I should apply to work at Red Hat. And I was successful in this. Moved to Brisbane, and I worked at Red Hat for a number of years, and then I left Red Hat, and now I work at SUSE, continuing my work as part of the 389 team. And this was really exciting for me because the 389 team, who is mostly pictured here, not everyone was present in this photo, they're all lovely people, and they all really care about their work and doing the best possible for customers and the identities of the people that we store in this software. And beyond just holding each other to a high standard of work, the kindness that this team has showed and their patience is really exceptional to me as a community, and it makes me very happy to be part of that. And being part of that team meant that I got to see even more places where LDAP had ended up. As a NoSQL-like database with eventually consistent replication, it could be found in so many places, from authentication at universities, to supermarkets and businesses around the world, to finance for storing account details and authenticating transactions, and even telco for storing phone subscriber data and validating phone handsets, and even more. Part of our work as a team is to continually make this project better. And the last 5 years, I can really assert that's happened with, and many aspects of the 389 project have really improved with inspiration from so many places. And one of those places was, in fact, Russell Keith McGee's talk at PyCon AU. And unfortunately, I can't remember what year, but he gave a really interesting talk on names and identities because he has a problem with his name. And that is that a lot of software doesn't like his name because it contains a hyphen, which generally is referred to as a non-ASCII character. And in fact, a lot of problems happen with names that have non-ASCII characters in a lot of software systems. But there's a lot of other really interesting things about names around the world. Names are this really amazing reflection of society and culture. For example, we have names that include things like son, daughter, or child of. And in fact, these names, depending on grammatical context, can even change. We have some names that have different order. We have the family name first and then the given name second. And in fact, you generally refer to the individual by their family name unless you're very close to them, at which point you're allowed to use the given name. Some cultures have multiple family names. So in Spain, you have two family names inherited, one from your one parent, one from the other parent, and then you get one of each of them. And then when you have a child, you get to choose which of your two family names you hand on to your child. And I think that's a really cool cultural thing. There are some countries that even have nicknames as a culturally preferred element. For example, in Thailand, where this individual, while he has a legal name, they probably want to be referred to as something else. So we need to be able to account for that. And of course, then we have individuals who don't have any family name at all, and they just choose to have a given name. And this is no means an exhaustive list of all the different interesting aspects of names around the world. But Russell gave this talk about names and how systems couldn't accept them. And so I decided to walk away from this and say, okay, how does LDAP handle these names? Can we, store all of this data properly? So as mentioned, LDAP structures everything with schema. And so I decided to look at the schema for a person in LDAP. And as we can see here, there's an attribute called given name, which is the part of a person's name that is not their surname. We have surname, which is the name strings for the family names of a person. And we have the person object class, which is the basis for an entry that represents a human being. And the person object class is actually inherited by a large number of other object classes all throughout Active Directory and LDAP standards. And, fundamentally, at some point in the stack, that's going to be used. But the problem is that it has this requirement for must surname. And that's problematic because, we don't know if the person doesn't have a surname or not. So there's probably better ways that we can represent names here. So in 389, we decided to update this. And so we actually wrote our own schema and we updated this. And we made it so that we have now a display name, which is the preferred name of a person to be used when they want to be displayed. We have the legal name, which is their legal name as referred to on a government identity. And then within the NS person type, which we now attempt to use by default in 389 as much as possible, you must have a display name. And you may have a legal name. Of course, you can, depending on business constraints, you could make that a must, but by default, we don't request it. And I think this is a really good way of actually handling these names. And it can actually account for all of this. All of the fields I've just mentioned are all UTF-8 and can do case-insensitive searching, and they are case-preserving as well, which is really good. So we can actually represent all of these names. But this change actually came against resistance. And that resistance came from someone who was not a member of the identity management community. It was actually someone who is extremely senior and well-known within a very major open source distribution. And this individual actually came into our mailing list and said their concern was whether there are affordances for front-end developers to create usable interfaces on top of this. And I went, what? What do you mean? And they said, well, how can I sort by last name? We need to be able to, identify the last name. I was like, but you can't do that. Here are the last names or the family names. Some of these, for example, Isa bin Osman, that name might change based on grammatical context. And it's arguable whether the bin is part of the last name or not, given that I think that is I believe that's Malaysian for of. So is that part of the last name or not? What about Teller? They don't have a last name. What about Maria? Which of her two family names should we sort by? This whole concept was, I feel like it was a not possible to satisfy. But this change almost actually never got through because of this resistance to this. And that was, thankfully it did pass and we did get it in 2018. But it was very demoralizing to see this kind of resistance coming from open source against this kind of progressive change. So, moving on. A different area that I've expressed interest in, if you were watching my talk last year about multi-factor authentication, is of course multi-factor authentication. And so, LDAP today doesn't support it, so we want to support it. So we have the right way to do multi-factor authentication, which is where you have a split password and TOTP field. And Given the password, you know to put that in a password field. Given the THP, you put that in the THP field. You can check it. And as was discussed at more length in the talk last year, the incorrect method of handling this is to combine these two fields together. So, and the reason for this is that it just breaks password managers. You know, you've got a dynamic element at the end and a static element at the front. Most password managers believe that it's a single whole string, and now there's a dynamic element. It can't actually save, store, and autofill this. And it also confuses users because there's now overlapping inputs within one field. So it can be confusing as to what is actually required here. So this is the UI that we want to be presented, and the UI that is often created can be a reflection of the API as we create it as developers. And so as an LDAP server, we want to offer an API that is reflective of the user interaction that we have here on the left-hand side of screen with the separate fields. So if we wanted to add this to LDAP, we have a look at the authentication mechanism in LDAP. Now, in LDAP, it's called a bind request. And we have two choices. We have password only, which is called simple, and that uses what is called an octet string or a UTF-8 string. Or we have SASL, which is the simple authentication and security layer. So if we just did this with the password field, the problem is that we're now recreating that poor UX on the right, and that's not going to encourage people to do the right thing as developers. If we use SASL, however, the problem is that while it has simple in its name, it's anything but. It's a very large and complicated project and very much inactive in a lot of ways. And so extending SASL to do TOTP would be a difficult exercise, let alone getting everyone's clients updated to also be able to do this as well. So why not just extend the LDAP protocol? Why not add native TOTP support into this authentication group? So the problem is that LDAP has a defunct IETF working group, and 2 attempts to revive it, as I'm aware of, in the last 5 or 6 years have both failed. And in fact, there's really only one LDAP client library within open source. There's a few others here and there, but the majority of the time when your open source system is talking to an LDAP server, you're using liblDAP, which is owned by the OpenLDAP project. And the problem with the OpenLDAP project is because they have a monoculture over this library, we need to convince them to accept any changes that we make. And the problem is that they have a community which has a bit of a reputation. And this is one of their mails from their mailing list. And just to read an excerpt, it says, "You will be chided, mocked, and denigrated. There is such a thing as a stupid question. You will be publicly mocked and made unwelcome. This is entirely intentional and by design." And this is not a community that I want to work with. This is not a community that says we would like to grow and change and develop as people to make things better for our users. And so wanting to contribute to the OpenLDAP library to add something like TOTP, let alone anything else that we may want to do, it suddenly becomes a much harder proposition. And if we really look at the technologies in open source identity management, we can really start to see that things are getting a little bit stagnant in some ways. The 4 major open source identity management projects really are OpenLDAP from 1997, the 389 project from 2005, FreeRPA, which is a combination of 389 and Kerberos, and then Samba 4, which is an open source reimplementation of Microsoft's Active Directory standards. Now, the problem with these open source identity management projects is that, unfortunately, because one of the major projects in OpenLDAP especially has that reputation of being unwelcoming, people aren't exactly willing to want to contribute. And realistically, these APIs are just hard to use. They're binary protocols, they're very gnarly, the documentation is often poor at best. Even the tooling in the command lines confuse me, and I work on the stuff. Like, how does it feel to a new user? It must look like, they're climbing up an ice wall that's vertical. And it's just, people find LDAP hard to use, let alone Kerberos. Most people, if you say, okay, use Kerberos, their eyes will glaze over and they'll run for the hills. Like most developers, look, they will integrate with an LDAP API, begrudgingly, but they'll do it. But you never see someone saying, yeah, let's implement native Kerberos and GSS API in our stack. That's a great idea. No one does it because it's just too hard. And really, the world is moving away from these things, People want HTTP APIs. People want introspectable systems. They want to be able to investigate these things. They want something that's clearer, simpler, and much more human friendly. And we aren't really doing a good job of delivering that today. But there's also a lot of parallel changes that are going on in the world. Some really interesting stuff has been coming out in especially the web-oriented areas of identity, with things like OAuth and OpenID in 2005. Then we start to see identity as a service projects like G Suite, Okta, Ortho. As we've heard from other attendees, the identity as a service where a cloud vendor will just host all your identities and everything happens. Azure AD was around earlier, but Azure AD Sync really made it possible for people to take their on-premise Active Directory, which is the backbone of corporate identity, and put it into the cloud. And then we even see these really cool developments in the last couple of years around, cryptographic authenticators like Windows Hello, WebAuthn, things like that. All of this advancement is going on in these areas, and they're becoming so popular due to their ease of use in like not only cryptographic authenticators, but just their APIs, these identity as a service projects, and they're really advancing the state of what an identity management system should be. But it feels like this gap between all of these LDAP and Kerberos focused projects and the more modern HTTP focused projects, this feels like there's a gap between them, and it's just continually widening. And as much as we have made improvements in the 389 team and we've done a lot to make the project better, it's just not enough to catch up with what's going on the other side of the world. And so I was really disappointed in this. This is really difficult for me because I really care about identity management. I really care about what I do, and to just feel like I was struggling in this. I really wanted to stop having to say no to things. I'm tired of saying no, we don't have a REST API. No, we don't have TOTP. I really wanted to start being able to say yes. Why can't we have these things? Why can't we have an open source identity management system that's as good as Azure AD or any of the others? But you can run it yourself, like FreeRPA or SAMA 4. That supported all of these nice HTTP APIs first and foremost, but also your existing infrastructure integrations to traditional and Unix deployments. Could we break away from this LDAP and Kerberos mindset that in a way was limiting our thinking about what identity management could be? So in September of 2018, I decided to start a new project. And this is where I started the Cunning DM project. Cunning DM is a identity management system fully written in Rust, which aims to be, what I believe and some others believe is the open source identity management of potentially the future. And there's a lot of lessons that as a project we have been able to take from the successes and mistakes of the existing open source and proprietary IDM projects. There's a lot of development that still needs to occur. It's still a young project, but it can do a lot of things that you might expect from a traditional identity management system. For example, we have Unix system integration. We have PAM and NS-switch libraries, which were inspired by TripleSD, but it fixes a lot of the performance and reliability issues that existed there. And these modules have even passed security screening by the product security teams at SUSE as well. It has Radius integration for your Wi-Fi and your VPNs so that you can continue to authenticate network infrastructure services through something like Cunning. It has a read-only LDAP gateway for application integrations that maybe, aren't going to speak something else like maybe OAuth or something like that. But we also have many parts that are only found in newer identity management systems. Like, we have a REST API first, and we want to add SCIM in the future. We have capability for a lot of really interesting security features like password bad listing and high quality password checking using things like ZXCVBN. We have an entry recycle bin so that, if you make a mistake, you can undo your changes and get things back. And it really just has like a really simple set of configurations and design details in the protocols just to make things a bit more efficient and really learning from some of the mistakes of, say, like 389, which has a much bigger configuration. And there's much, much more to come. There's some really cool stuff, though, again, where we've been inspired. And like one of these sources of inspiration was Jeremy Stott's LCA talk last year. So we already have the capability to do FreeRPA-like SSH public key distribution within your infrastructure. So you can upload your SSH public key into Cunning, and then the Unix client will then be able to read that and cache it to authenticate you. But in the future, we want to add SSHCA support, which will allow for ephemeral or permission-limited SSH authentication, which I think is a really cool thing. And, you know, this is the kind of technology that we only see in like other IAM systems. We have a lot of really interesting tech in terms of concurrent data structures and multi-threading and high-performance database technology. We even invented a transactional caching system where we have a cache that is multi-view concurrently readable and actually is ACID compliant and can be rolled back during read and write operations. And this fully transactional design of the server was actually inspired by ZFS, with this mentality that everything should always be correct at every stage of the pipeline in the process. And, you know, we even created data structures to help allow us to do this. And just because of this, you know, it means that there's very little blocking within the server. So our performance is already very close to 389 directory server via the LDAP gateway with very little work on optimization. I believe on a 4-core machine with 8 gig of RAM, I was benching at 32,000 searches per second on a database with 100,000 users and 4,000 authentications per second, which is the kind of numbers that a server would need to be able to sustain authentication for an entire university or other large organization. So this bodes really well in terms of the architecture that we've laid down for the project to continue to grow. We're also the first identity management system, especially within open source, to actually have a query optimizer, which sounds like it shouldn't be, you know, a thing, but we do, and that actually helps a lot as well. Devices are, you know, part of your authentication, and that's like this idea and this mindset that was in the project from day one. And because multi-factor authentication was planned from very early on, we knew that we needed to structure certain things in certain ways. And this is why we also created the WebAuthn library for Rust. And that library today already supports Touch ID, Windows Hello, YubiKeys, and a few others. And we've just actually finished wrapping up some of the server-side components to do WebAuthn, and there's just a little bit of polish in the CLI tools that needs to happen to make it a little bit nicer. But WebAuthn is now supported as a either a sole authentication mechanism or as with multi-factor with passwords and things like that. And we want to have things like, you know, the ability to express proper like security and account policies that say, yeah, this person needs a verified token like something like Touch ID, or this one can be just a YubiKey, things like that. You know, really being able to embed this kind of advanced policy into these projects, which we can't do today. And another extension of the devices as part of authentication that I think is really interesting is that the way that our Radius integration actually works. So a lot of people, when they hear Radius, they you know that MS Chat v2 is really the only supported Radius protocol for Wi-Fi devices. And MS Chat v2 necessitates you storing password hashes as NTLM or MD4, which is known to be broken cryptographically, or plain text. So instead of storing your main account password in one of these formats so that we can do Radius for you, which may expose your account to some kind of compromise, we actually give your account a separate Radius password. And what this means is that we can generate that password on the server, and when you want to use that, you can retrieve it, and we have these ideas about automatic enrollment of those profiles, such as displaying a QR code so you can scan and it will automatically join your phone to the Wi-Fi and add all the Radius details. It means that you can change the Radius password without breaking your main account. You can change your main account password without breaking your phone's access to the Wi-Fi. And it also just limits damage in a compromise, that the compromise of the Radius account does not compromise your main account password. And this really helps to bring in this device as a part of identity mentality, which is really cool that your authentication to the network is separate to your authentication from anything else. And there's so much more to improve on in how we authenticate using devices as part of that. And there's a lot of other really interesting design details in the project, especially with how we've done the Unix integration. So it's really common in a Unix system for the home directory to come from something like an NFS or a Samba server, and it might be exported from a server with, say, like volhome's username. And then we mount using username as the primary key, and then we mount that to our client with, say, /home wbrown in this example. A common problem, however, is when people go to change their username. Because this is effectively the primary key, when we change that username, we have a situation where the mount cannot be found. So if I've changed my name to William Jones and my username to W Jones, unless there was a process running on the actual exported NFS server to update W Brown to W Jones, this is not going to work, and this is going to break. And so often what this leads to is a lot of sites will say, no, you can't change your username, or a username change is this really big, arduous, complex policy thing, and there's all these different areas. And then once you do the username change, your account is just broken for the rest of time. And I don't really think that's acceptable from an identity management system. Anyone should be able to change their username at any time. I'm not the name police. Change your name. My job is to make it so that that works. So the way that we approach this in Cunning is slightly different. We make it so that your home directory is actually based on the UUID of your account. And an upcoming feature is that on logins, we'll automatically add a symlink of /home/your username to the UUID of your home folder. So this means that your NFS server is now exporting all of the home directories by UUID. And so what this means is that if you do change your username, all we have to do is update that symlink. And suddenly, no more pain. And in fact, this also encourages developers to, to really see that the UUID is how you should be foreign keying into something like Cunning DM. And username changes are something any individual within Cunning DM can initiate on their own at any point in time. Everyone has the ability to change their own username with the constraint that it must be unique. But that's a different technical thing. But part of the reason, but allowing people to change their usernames is one of those things that, seems like a detail that a lot of people wouldn't put a lot of energy and effort into. But the reason why we've done this is, as a project from very early on, we added something. And that is a statement about the ethics and rights and how we want to approach our work. And, to read from it, it says, Cunning DM is a project that will store, process, and present people's personal data. That means we have a responsibility to respect the data of all people who could be using our system. Many who interact indirectly or do not have choice in this platform. And an example of that, when I say don't have choice, is when you get a new job and you go to that business, you can't choose if they're using Active Directory or 389 or something else. You have to just deal with whatever they have. And if that means that whatever they have doesn't want to let you change your name, well, that's not good enough, And so for me, I know that there's going to be a lot of people in that situation. And so our job is to make sure that we write a project that says, no, people can change their names. And by having this as a fundamental part of our project, when this kind of thing comes up, where if we've made a mistake in how we represent an individual, the onus and the responsibility is now on us, that we need to make tough engineering decisions to fix that problem. And this is why the project from very early on has had a lot of capability and infrastructure for in-place on-upgrade migrations at almost every level of the stack, so that if we do make this mistake, because I guarantee I'm not perfect, I'm going to make a mistake somewhere, we're going to need to change something, but we have to be able to do it because we need to make sure that we are representing identities in the right way. And I think that's what's super cool about identity management. It's kind of everywhere and it affects all of us. IDM is something that we have to interact with every day. And this is what makes IDM exciting. Every single one of us is a person. Our identity is in software all around the world. From our laptops to a website that we log into to, order online books, or our workplaces. These all have identity management systems. They underpin everything to do with modern computer security and just so much. And it should be accessible to all of us. If we are going to be represented in this, it should be accessible. And that's why I'm really, excited to be working on this project. And that's why it has so many interesting components. In fact, Cunning DM is a bit of an umbrella project. It has the main identity project, but it also has 5 other sub-projects. And there have been 7 other major contributors. And since September 2019, when I open sourced it, there's been more than 340 commits to the project. And there's also just been so many other non-code contributions that have been just as valuable into the project, and support and encouragement of so many people within it. And some of these sub-projects are things like the WebAuthn server-side library for Rust. We've got a WebAuthn soft token for automated testing. We have concurrent data structures. We have compressed database indexes for high-speed set operations. And now I can't remember what the last one is. I think it's the LDAP bindings for Rust. And then we've got the Cunning project. But that's what's so interesting, right? And this is, again, why I find IDM exciting. It spans so many cool areas, all the way from social and cultural, aspects of humanity and how people want to be represented and how we as a society need to continually learn and develop to improve that, to human interaction and user experience to make sure that people can authenticate to their software securely, to API design and high-performance multi-threaded concurrent systems and databases and so much more. Like, IDM is such a cool technology and it's such an unsolved problem. And so that's why I'm so passionate about what I work on and continuing my work with both Cunning and 389. So I think I'm actually a little bit early, but I really want to thank you all for coming and spending time to listen to my presentation. I'm sorry I'm a bit early. My office is actually really warm. It says 31 on my temperature meter. That's why I'm sweating a little bit. I can't turn on the fan. It makes too much noise. But thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Liam. That was a fantastic talk. I have to say that anyone that works in enterprise would have been nodding along with so many things that you've said, because I certainly was.
Yeah, well, that's one of those things. I think that, well, even just more broadly, I feel like having a different set of experiences is so valuable for so many different areas. Like, even with identity management, a broad range of experiences are needed for something like this. My background is in online education. I used to be part of the online education team at Uni Adelaide, and then I went to the sysadmin team, and then that gave me a lot of insight being a customer of the IDM project to then being a developer of it. And then, you also, I've had help from someone who does statistics on this project, and, people from web development backgrounds and all these other stuff. It's so good to have broad, experiences to bring all those different things into work. And that's why, again, I find it so cool. Like, this stuff just,
yeah.
Question.
We do have time for questions, and we do have questions. The first one I've got is from Jenny. She's asking if Cunning is able to handle people that have more than one legal name.
Ooh, that's a good one. Today it doesn't, but that's easy to do. And if you open that issue on GitHub, that one's actually an easy fix. So if you don't open the issue on GitHub, I will. I'm going to write a note.
All right. I'm sure that one of our volunteers, we've got these questions written down, so that's fine. You don't need to write it down. We'll give you them in chat afterwards. The next question comes from Alyssa. And they have started off with an apology. If it was addressed, they're sorry. The question is, does it retain a historical record of prior names to track users? Otherwise, it could be abused to cover up account compromise. So not
today we don't track that, but I've thought about it. It would be possible to add. I think that would be the kind of extension to the project which you would optionally want to turn on, because there's a lot of situations where you deploy an IDM and you don't want to track people's past names for various reasons. But to have that functionality in terms of what you say, in terms of security for tracking account compromise and what the person's name was at some point, that's easy to add.
Alyssa went on to ask if the usernames could be reused, and if so, if it's possible to prevent that, to block reuse of usernames.
Yeah, that'll be doable. Easy. Yep.
Cool.
Again, that's the kind of input that's really useful. And again, if you want to open that issue on GitHub, please do, because that's the kind of thing that's really interesting and something that we can solve.
Nice. I've got a question from Martin Vizier. Martin observes that there's some organizations that feel that it isn't for an identity management solution to push an ethic on them. Can you think of the can you think of the rights that the company might have in such a situation? I may not have phrased that question all that clearly.
As in, I think the question they might be asking is more about, would a business want to use a piece of software that's so opinionated? Might be
yeah, that's a good way of phrasing that. Yeah.
Because that's realistically what it is that, Cunning DM is opinionated, and it's opinionated in a very specific way. So while these features do exist, you can disable them, but I don't encourage it because we want to do the right thing out of the box by default. But, the things about, for example, people being able to change their own name at any time or username at any time, that's an access control that exists within the server. And the access controls, you can disable that access control if you want to disallow people from doing that. Right. But again, I know that there are businesses that say, oh, we have these special requirements that make it so that we have to be able to stop username changes. And I say, are your needs that special? Or is it that you just don't want to have to fix all of your other processes that would break if you allow it? Yeah. And so that's kind of why I'm kind of pushing on the doing something really opinionated, is because this way we can kind of drag stuff forward into a state where I think it's more reflective and representative of people, because people want to change. For example, again, names is a good one because that's really the contentious one, I think, for a lot of businesses. If you change someone's username, you can break databases and stuff like that because they're using these foreign keys. And
I've seen this at my workplace. People change their names because they get married. People change their names
people want to change their names. You can't avoid
wrong.
that. You can't avoid people changing their names. It is impossible, And so to try and say, oh, the IDM project should disallow it because our business disallows it. Well, is that right? We need to reflect, computers don't exist without humans. Computers exist because of human interaction, and we need them. And so our computers should not be dictating to us how our society lives and how our cultures exist and should be represented, but our computers should be in support of these social and cultural constructs that exist as humans. And you know what? Humans are complicated. Humans are messy.
Is it fair to say, William, that this is kind of a downstream decision? It's not up to your software to make that.
Yeah,
it's
absolutely.
Up to maybe in a way, the business or the person.
Yeah. Like I said, we have a set of opinions that is trying to reflect how we should interact with people. You can choose to ignore them if you want, but I really don't recommend it. So all of this stuff, the way that it's structured, you could change up the some of the types and remove some of the fields and change it. But we do try to do the right thing by default. So I think that's what they're saying.
Yeah. Tom wants to know, kind of on a similar line, what sort of capacity does Cunning have for custom or extended user attributes?
Yep, easy. So Cunning DM has a similar, my background is in LDAP. I'm always going to be a little bit influenced by that. And so one of the things about LDAP that is good is that the object classing model and the attribute schema model does have some really nice properties. It's just also at the same time very complicated. So we have a very highly simplified schema model and then slightly inspired a bit by Active Directory. So all you can do is you just add your own attributes and classes, and you can add your own attributes, and they have strong types in the background and data validation and a whole bunch of other really nice things. And you can say whether they're single value, multi-value. I've got some thoughts about making it so you can cap the number of values for some stuff to prevent certain types of attacks. But yeah, extensibility is absolutely there if you want to add your own custom data fields, because that's a very common thing that identity management and businesses need, is they need to add their own data fields. So yeah, that was always and it's always in there. So
we've only got one more minute to go, so we're going to take, I think, just one last question. Sorry to everyone else that's been asking questions. This one comes.
My email, wbrown@susa.de, and I'm in the chat, so please email me, and I'd love to hear from you.
There we go. We will be able to join you in chat. So the last question is, if the LDAP bridge is read-only, how can you connect AD client machines to a Cunning domain?
Don't.
Oh, okay.
That was the speedrun version. I don't want to cut Samba 4's lunch. I'm not going to try and implement Windows joining to Cunning DM. So that is something where I want to make Cunning DM to say Samba 4 synchronization, because Samba 4 does what it does really well. To re-implement and make Windows join happen, I'd need to re-implement all of Samba 4, and that is an undertaking that I don't want to do.
Thank you very much, William. This has been a great talk. Stick around, everyone. We have another great talk coming up. We've got Aaron Boxer and Marcus et al. They're going to be talking about open sourcing AI-powered video analytics. That's at 2:25, so we've got a 10-minute break before then. So we'll see you soon. Thanks, William. Bye, everyone.